All right, the classic album of the week is by Donovan. It's called The Real Donovan. This was his second album. Has anybody heard of Donovan? That's it? In my 9 o'clock class, no one had heard of Donovan. Donovan was huge. He was basically almost as well known as Bob Dylan back in the day. He was part of the folk music era that was in the late 60s and early 70s. Catch the Wind is the song that is probably the big hit on this particular album. But anyway, you might want to just take a listen to some of Donovan's songs. One is about the Vietnam War. It's called The War Goes On. So anyway, it's an interesting era, the late 1960s. Anyway, you might listen to Donovan, but yeah, I can't believe how few people have heard of Donovan. But yes, there's Peter, Paul, and you must have heard of Peter, Paul, and Mary and that group. Okay, so anyway, there's this whole era at the time of folk music, and he was one of the big names in folk music. All right. Okay. So last time what we were talking about was Mises was explaining why socialism can't produce wealth for the masses. Okay, and we said there was two big deals about why that was the case. One was, how do you solve the incentive problem? That is, how do I get people to work hard? How do I get people to take on the risk of innovation? Again, some people will work hard anyway. We talked about, Adam Smith never says you won't find the benevolent butcher. But if we look at it systematically, if we want to create wealth for the masses, I need some sort of incentive for that to happen. And who does that is the in a market system, was when we were talking about profit, right? We were saying that profit acts as this incentive for people to take on the risk and innovation. We talked about profit as this incentive to move goods from places where you guys aren't demanding it anymore to places where you are demanding it, right? Prices signal, are a method of dealing with this second problem. He says, you know what? Maybe you can solve this incentive problem, right? Maybe I can get you to work hard for the good of the country, right? Or for the good of the city, or for the good of the organization, or whatever. Okay? So you could conceive of a situation where you can solve that incentive problem. It's not likely, but you could. But the real problem, or a major problem that you can't deal with, we said, was the information problem, right? How do I know where to put the resources? How do I know that you guys value oil more in the production of gasoline than in the production of fertilizer? Or would you rather use milk in the production of ice cream or in milk to drink? Okay, or do you want it into chocolate milk? How can we possibly know that? And the problem the focus here was on the fact that information is decentralized. Right? So this was the second problem, was information is decentralized. And we talked about that. Hayek is going to talk about this as well in the Constitution of Liberty in 1960. Mises is bringing it up here in 1927. But what does it mean to be decentralized? It means only you know how many Coney Island hot dogs you're going to want. Only you know how many dishes of macaroni and cheese with pulled pork at Hillsdale Brewing Company you're going to want. You're going to want a lot. I'll tell you that much. I don't know if anybody ever had the macaroni and cheese with pulled pork? Yeah. So anyway, I can't possibly know that, right? I have to ask you guys, right? I have no mechanism of knowing that. So what happens? We can in the market system, if you guys want more of something, then what's going to happen? It says what? The demand curve shifts to the right. Okay. So you guys, it turns out that you guys now want more macaroni and cheese with pulled pork. What's going to happen? We said, well, the demand curve will shift to the right. We'll go from P1, Q1 to P2, Q2. So if demand shifts, then what's going to happen? We got demand increases, price is going to go up, and then what's going to happen? Profit goes up, right? Because profit, we assume that economic profit is 0 to start with, right? Because if there's economic profit, what's going to happen? So now profit goes up, so profit bigger than 0, what's going to happen? Firms will enter, right? And that's going to shift that supply curve out to the right, right? So supply shifts. And what's going to happen? Profit goes down, and then eventually what happened? Profit hits 0. So we have a mechanism in the market capitalist system to move resources around depending on what you guys want. And then we can just take it the opposite way, right? You guys decide you no longer want to smoke cigarettes. What's going to happen? The demand shifts to the left, price is going to fall, profit turns negative, firms exit the industry, they'll continue to exit until and as they exit, the supply curve shifts left, price will start to rise, and if it's possible that you end up with fewer firms and the thing stabilizes. It's possible that it just goes away, right? There are some goods that, Underwood typewriters don't have them anymore. There's nobody making Underwood typewriters anymore, right? Why? Because the demand shifted to the left. So how did we know to stop making Underwood typewriters and start making Dell computers? Okay, we didn't have a minister of technology that was out there saying, oh, guess what? People are going to like these computers. Why don't we invent computers and stop making typewriters? Okay? What happened was this market capitalist system generates these signals and have incentives for people to move resources around. And the price signal and the profit signal let people know that are producers, people know how much to move things around. But there's no way to do that if we're looking at if we had a socialist system that's centrally planned. So they can't solve either of these problems. They certainly can't solve the second problem. There's no mechanism for a central planner to know how information is there because it's so decentralized. But he doesn't say that socialism cannot exist, right? Socialism can. If you look at a 13th century monastery, for example, it's my example here. Monastery. We'll put 13th century monastery. That could last, and why would that work? That worked because A, you don't really have the incentive problem in that all the monks, right, are going to be doing whatever they're going to be doing in order to get to heaven or whatever, right? So, or they're just for the good of the monastery. So you don't have this incentive problem. They're all going to be out there whether they're getting economic profit or not, okay? And there's not a big information problem. If this is a 13th century monastery, I don't need to know whether they want the TikTok app or they want the What's Up app or whatever. I don't need to know that, right? And so if you have a very simple world where people all sort of act together and you're not having to deal with much production, it can't exist. And so Mises isn't saying socialism can't exist. He says it can't create wealth for the masses, right? You can't have a situation where you have wealth for the masses. Then he says, okay, we've shown that socialism can't work. First of all, we've shown that capitalism produces wealth for the masses because it solves these problems. But we've now shown that socialism can't produce wealth for the masses. What about this third way, what he calls interventionism? interventionism. And what this is where the government intervenes in the economy. So this would be more like fascism, where you have private property, but the government's telling you what to do. Only we haven't got clear to fascism. We haven't got clear to the central planning. We're sort of in between, right? So what happens is the government's going to intervene, and it's going to put restraints on what you can produce. It's going to maybe tell you that you have to provide health insurance for your employees. There's all sorts of things that the government tells you what you can and can't do. You can't put drain tile if it's on your land, if it's within a certain distance from the navigable waters of the United States, etc. Okay? So, can regulation improve the capitalist system? Well, when you take Econ 402 or 415 or 472, the public finance, public choice, and law and economics class, we talk about what are called externalities. Okay, this is an issue where what happens with an externality, your use of your property affects me, and it's not picked up in the price system. It's not picked up in the price system. So what's going on here is we're saying that maybe there's a role for government here to do what? To establish the property right. Okay? If, for example, you are having a party, right? And it's a Friday night, and there's and you're in an apartment, and it's next to another apartment, and you're making all sorts of noise at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock in the morning, okay? Your use of your property is affecting me. I can't sleep, right? There's no good mechanism for that property to move to the one who values it the most, okay? So there's no price system that's out there to fix that. If that's the case, then you can have a reason for government intervening in the economy that would improve the situation. And again, we go through this in a good deal of detail in those upper division classes. There's a thing called the Coase theorem that Ronald Coase, a Nobel Prize winner, wrote a paper in 1960 called The Problem of Social Cost, where he explains that if the transactions costs are low, that if we can bargain with one another, what the government's role is to establish the property right, which is what Mises was talking about, right? Mises was talking about what's the role of government? To establish property rights and to protect property rights. This externality would not be interventionism in the sense that he's talking about. If there's an externality issue, it falls more in the property rights part of it. Do you have the right to make noise in your apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning, or do I have the right to have silence in my apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning, right? Somebody's got to make that decision. Now, oftentimes, again, that will, the social custom will fix that, right? So how do you fix that problem? If you're going to have a party, how do you fix the problem with the neighbor? You invite them to the party, right? You invite them to the party, okay? If they say no, then they're going to feel bad about knocking on your door and saying, hey, this party's you're having too much fun at this party that I said I wasn't going to come to, okay? There's customs to deal with that, but the point is that he's not talking about an issue of what are the property rights, which is what's externalities. So you might have a zoning law that says that you can't put a let's say you can't put a restaurant in a neighborhood, or you can't put a Dollar General in a neighborhood where there's just housing or something like that, right? So we have different zoning laws and things like that. But those are really following not so much in his interventionism issue, those are following in the property rights issue. He's talking about, can the government make things better by the central planner telling you what to do and what not to do with your property. What his main argument is that if, when the government intervenes in the economy, and not in just this issue of establishing property rights, if the government intervenes in the economy, what's going to happen? He says the big issue, it's going to create unintended consequences. Right? It's going to create unintended consequences. And so what's going to happen is this government intervention happens. It sets wage and price controls in World War II. This is what it did. Right? So now what's the problem? Well, you set the wage, it was said you can't raise the wage above a certain amount, right? And you can't make your prices above a certain amount. Well, what's going to happen? Well, I got a big demand for labor out there to build airplanes and tanks and everything else. And what's happened to the supply of labor? It's gone down because it's all gone into the armed forces. Okay? So then what's going to happen? I'm going to figure out a way to get around that, right? And so now you've created this unintended labor shortage. So what happened? The manufacturing sector says, how about if what we do is we provide health care benefits? Does that count against the wages? The wage control legislation? And the courts ruled, no, it doesn't count against it. Okay? Then what do? In 1953, we say, we're going to make it so that we're going to make sure that that is not taxable as income to you. And your company can deduct it. So now what happens is, in the highest marginal tax rates in the 1950s were up around, the highest marginal rates up around 90%. But the bottom line is marginal tax rates are pretty high. So let's say your tax rate's 50%. So if I, your employer, give you $1 in income, you got 50 cents to go out and buy health insurance with it. But I go out and buy the health insurance for you. I can buy $1 worth of health insurance. So what'll happen? The employers will start paying the health insurance, and your health insurance then gets tied to your job. So now what happens? Now you lose your job and you've got diabetes. You go out and try and get get health insurance, right? And you've got diabetes, and say, well, we're not going to cover you for diabetes, right? And so you say, well, that's a problem, right? So what do? In 1965, we established Medicare and Medicaid, and what do? They cover the people a lot of the people that aren't employed, right? That don't have a job. So then what happens? Medicare and Medicaid start going up, and then what we do is we say, hey, how are we going to deal with somebody who was employed and now goes somewhere else? How am I going to deal with that? Well, then I'm going to have to make it so that you can't be denied for a pre-existing condition. Okay? So once we said you can't be denied for a pre-existing condition, what's going to happen? You're not going to buy insurance until you get sick. So how am I going to solve that? Because, if you think about it, what would you do? What if life insurance worked that way? Right? Aunt Sally dies, and you go buy $1 million policy on her life, and they say, well, wait a minute, she's already dead. You say, well, it's a pre-existing condition. Come on. Okay? So now what's going to happen? We're going to have to require everybody to buy health insurance. Okay? So what's happened along the way? The reason that you ended up with the Affordable Care Act is that you started with wage and price controls in the 1940s. That's how you got there. You had all these unintended consequences come on, and every time you have these unintended consequences, the government has to intervene. Yeah?
Would you think that mandatory health care also contributes to high health care costs? If health care providers know that you have somebody supplementing your health care, then they're more apt to charge a higher price, whether or not someone.
Yes, it does certainly. I mean, all this is going to affect the price of health care, right? If you and it creates all sorts of problems. That is, you never look at what. If you've ever been to the hospital, right? You don't go through all the detail and see how much they charge you for the Kleenex and how much they charge you for the lunch that you know, or meals or whatever they had and all that stuff. You don't even look at it, right? All you want to know is does the insurance pay for it? You don't care what the price is, okay? So you end up with all sorts of interesting aspects of that. But the bottom line is, Mises's argument is that once you happen, you create these unintended consequences. And he used the example where if you fix a price of a good, which we just did in terms of wages, okay? But what if you fix the price of, let's say you fix the price of electricity, okay? So I'm gonna fix the price of electricity, right, below equilibrium. So the government comes in and says, you know what? We want it so that people can we want it so that poor people can heat their homes in the winter. So what's going to happen? There's going to be a shortage, right? So now I've created this shortage of electricity. Well, then what am I going to have to do? It's going to be unprofitable for me to create electricity, so profit's going to turn negative, and so prices are going to fall, or excuse me, the supply curve is going to shift to the left, firms are going to exit, right? So what I might do is try to keep that from happening. So what I could do is I could lower the price of, the government comes in, and what do? The government then responds, we lower the price of natural gas, which is used to produce the input into electricity, which is natural gas. Well, then what are you going to do? You can see what you're going to do is you're going to create this cycle, right? So then there's going to be shortage of natural gas. So then you have to figure out, what am I going to do to lower the price of an input of natural gas to make sure that supply curve stays where it is, right? So once the government intervenes, it creates these unintended consequences, which results in more government intervention. And of course, if you look at, then what might happen is the government's going to start to ration things, right? Which is what we did in World War II. There was rationing of all sorts of stuff in World War II. So you could have the government will begin to ration stuff, right? In order to fix the shortage issue, they're going to make it so you can't buy as much electricity as you did before because there's now this shortage of electricity. Okay? And so you can just follow through, and what we just thinking about, what's the incentives of things to happen, and you'll see that there's always going to create these other unintended consequences, which is going to result in more government intervention. If you just think about, he also uses the example of minimum wage, right? And we have a person running for president that is interested in the minimum wage. We've talked about minimum wage quite a bit, right? So let's say, and Mises is talking about what happens when you try to do a minimum wage. And he's using this section where it says once the government intervenes, it's going to cause unintended consequences, and then more government intervention. So if you were looking at it in terms of this presidential election, you'd say, oh, Mr. Biden, you're going to create these unintended consequences of the people that you think that you're helping, right, which is the low skilled, the people making low amounts of, that are low value of productivity. Their value of their marginal product is low. They're the ones that are going to lose their job, right? And these are the people that you think that you're helping. And when we did the minimum wage legislation, we noted that you're increasing the price of a substitute for high-skill labor, and so what's going to happen is you're going to get this movement towards high-skill labor. And if you also sort of think about it, I'm going to substitute the use of machinery, the use of drones, why in the world, again, why in the world is Walmart not opposed to an increase in the minimum wage, right? Because they're going to substitute your labor for the wages of somebody else, right? Like, what do? You go to the checkout line, right? And who's scanning the item for you? Who's bagging your groceries? You are, right? Let me sort of think about it. What's been happening as the government's been increasing the minimum wage? What do we expect to happen? We'd expect those things. There used to be a thing called a service station when I was a kid, right? And in a service station, you drove up, and guess what? Somebody your age came out and pumped your gas and checked your oil and washed your windshield and etc. And then you paid them. Today, what do? You drive up, you get out, you put your card in there, your Kroger savings card or whatever, and you pump your own gas, you wash your own windshield, and there's no one there, because if wages were $2 an hour, there'd certainly be people there, right, that have opportunity cost their time, low enough that they'd be there. So Mises's discussion in here, the minimum wage legislation, is something to think about when you're trying to explain to people whether this is a good policy to follow. That what's going to happen is you're going to create these unintended consequences of substituting capital for labor. You're going to have the low skilled are going to be losing their jobs, etc. So again, this is his idea that we got to think through what's going to happen. We got to think through these unintended consequences and be able to explain it to people. Now, it's interesting that basically what his claim is, which is probably overstated, is that once you create these unintended consequences, which create further unintended consequences, that this continues until you get complete central planning. That is, the government determines everything. Now, we are not there, okay? But clearly, there's a lot more government regulation today than there was in 1927 when Mises was talking about it. And if you look at the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation, if you get on their websites, they all have papers that analyze how many rules and regulations there are and how many thousands of pages of regulations there are, etc. And so we're certainly doing what Mises has argued, that once government's intervening, it continually intervenes until you end up with much more central planning than you otherwise would have. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get to where he argues. He argues that interventionism will lead to socialism. That you only got two options, capitalism and socialism. This interventionism isn't really sustainable. Now, it's interesting also that in this section, he talks about how public works projects aren't going to reduce unemployment. Right? Now, we haven't got to the Great Depression yet, but what did Franklin Delano Roosevelt do? Right? Public works projects. And guess what? It wasn't reducing unemployment. In fact, there was, if you look at great myths of the Great Depression, et cetera, the book little book that I've put on in the Econ 105 folder, and actually there's a few hard copies outside of Professor McGrath's office if you just want to pick up a hard copy. But anyway, the issue here is that he's predicting that if you got into this recession, this depression that I'm talking about happening, right? He's telling you this is going to happen. Anti-liberal thought's going to do that. He's going to say having the government step in and hire people isn't going to solve the problem. And it turns out that it didn't. Unemployment rates were higher in 1936 than they were in 1932, and so it wasn't working. Also here he talks about that how can you improve the wealth of the people who are poor? And he says, rather than a minimum wage, what do you need to do? You need to improve the productivity of labor. And our terms that we've been talking about is increase the value of the marginal product, right? So I'm going to increase what we've been calling the value of the marginal product of labor. That is, what's the added benefit of hiring that next worker? So how do you do that? Well, you could do that with education, right? You could go to welding school, okay? You can go to a school that teaches you how to do plumbing. In fact, this friend of mine called in a plumber had a little leak in his faucet. Plumber comes in, works on it for like 15 minutes, puts a new washer in, says that'll be $150, right? And my friend says, well, geez, I'm a brain surgeon. I don't make that kind of money. And the plumber says, well, neither did I when I was a brain surgeon. But the point is that you need to do something. You have to, if you can increase your education, or you can add what we've been talking about here. If we can add what we call capital, we'll talk more about this at the end of the class. But what do we mean? Machinery, computers, right? Internet, things like that, things that will make you more productive, right? So he's saying the only way to really, you can't by just increasing the minimum wage improve the living of the poor. What you're going to do is you're going to create these unintended consequences. The way to improve the living standards of the poor are to increase their productivity. Then he says it's the capitalist system that creates technology. That is, there's these incentives to innovate. And think about the technology of 1927. Technology of 1927 looks a lot different than it did here, right? I mean, even when I've been teaching here, and then I took a leave to be the chief of staff to Congressman from here. Nick Smith was the congressman. This was 1995. We didn't have email, okay? The way if we were corresponding, if we wanted to have a correspondence with several of the other congressmen, what we'd have to do is we have we call the blast fax. We used to fax everybody, okay? So think of the technology in 1927, and he's saying that capitalism creates technology. And not the other way around. That is, it isn't like technology happened and then capitalism happened. That is, what creates technology is this incentive to be in it to innovate, right? And this that we talked about many times. That is, without a capitalist system, we wouldn't have the technology that we do today. And he's noticing this in 1927. He said, without a capitalist system, we wouldn't have the technology that we do today, like telephone, right? Or black and white movies. I don't even know anybody know when the television first began? I don't either.
In the 30s or 40s.
That was right, the 30s and 40s?
Like a home TV or like
your home television.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, your home. Well, actually, I remember when I was in kindergarten, we used to go over to the neighbor's house to watch television because they had a television. They were like the richest people in the neighborhood because they had a black and white TV. So my dad and I used to go over to the neighbor's house, and then sometimes we could watch the Mickey Mouse Club or whatever. So technology is like rapidly changing, right? You guys watch things on your phone, right? If you told me, hey, we're going to watch a movie on the phone, you'd be going, how the hell are you going to do that, right? You got to dial the thing. So anyway, that's his point here, is that technology is driven through market capitalism. Now, he doesn't say that it's perfect, right? He's pretty clear. Remember that one of these says that it can't create happiness. He said contentment comes from within, right? That it's not a perfect system. But it's the only system, again, that can create wealth for the masses. And he says that defense of private property rights is akin to the defense of civilization, right? Defense of private property rights is akin to the defense of civilization. So very, this importance of property rights, and then we've talked about this before. One of the foundations of liberalism, one of the foundations is private property rights. Another is that you respect the property rights of others. Okay, and so then he comes up with the discussion of monopoly. Okay, and we've already talked about this before when we had profit, and this is what he talks about here. He says, what's monopoly? Well, a monopoly is a single seller. And he says, do we have to worry about monopoly? Is that a big problem in capitalism, that you'll end up with a bunch of monopolies? And he says that why do we not have to worry about monopoly? Why? You can't maintain it. You can't maintain a monopoly because what will happen is if you're earning economic profit, other firms will enter, right? That's how the market system works. So if you earn economic profit, firms enter. So you'll have other firms coming in. You don't have to worry about there's only a... And the only way that you can maintain a monopoly is to what? To keep innovating, right? I can't get my iPad to use the cellular network anymore. And so my daughter was home, and was home with the grandkids this couple days ago. And she's looking at it, and she goes, oh, here's the problem. Your iPad is so old, it can only use the operating system, iOS or whatever heck it is, 12 or something, and now we're using iOS 38 or something like that, right? And so it just can't do it anymore, right? And so how do you keep to be either a monopolist or the dominant producer of anything? Is you got to keep innovating, right? Because other firms will enter unless you have government restricting the entry. And that I have done some work on the telephone industry. And the telephone industry, why did that turned out to be a monopoly for a long period of time, et cetera. And that was because you had government regulation that made it a monopoly. And then, sort of a long story, but the bottom line is that eventually became deregulated. And so you end up with you guys all have cell phones and cellular network and all that. Yes?
Yeah, so how does that account for a Rockefeller or something that would go in and crash prices to drive everyone else out of business before raising?
Well, that's a good question. Can I come in and drive everyone out of business by lowering prices? If I'm lowering prices because I have a way of doing it that has a much lower marginal cost of production, we want that to happen, right? If we want prices to, if what I'm doing is I'm changing the technology, right? So I got, what is the supply curve is what? It's the marginal cost curve. We got a demand curve for whatever it is. Now what happens is I shift that supply curve to the right because I've changed the technology. That was one of the things that shifts the supply curve to the right. Okay? Then what should I expect to happen? I should expect prices are falling, right? And I'm going to garner all the constituents that are the people that are buying the product itself. I'm going to get the customers. If what I'm doing is I'm lowering my price below the cost of production to drive you guys out. Let's say we did that. Okay? So I say, oh, I'm going to enter the industry, and what I'm going to do, and I'm not having lower prices because I've changed the technology, which is exactly what did happen with Rockefeller. So what if I had to do that is let's say I'm going to lower the price below the cost of production. So what are you going to say? I'm going to trade off losses for this future monopoly. Right? I'm going to drive these other people out of business. What's the problem here? The problem is now I've driven you guys out of business. Then what am I going to do? I'm not going to still keep selling at below the cost of production or I'll go out of business, right? I got to raise my prices back up at some point. Okay? So then what's going to happen is I need to raise the prices back to the cost of production. What's going to happen if I'm making a monopoly profit? What's going to happen then?
Firms will enter.
Yeah, firms will enter, right? Firms will enter. And drive my economic profit to zero, right? So I have to have some mechanism, I'm going to have some mechanism to keep firms from entering once I've driven this set of firms out because I've lowered the price below the cost of producing. I'm going to have some mechanism to keep other firms from entering because now I've sustained these losses and I can't raise my price high enough to overcome that loss. So if you observe a company that's the sole producer of anything over any lengthy period of time, what must be going on? They must be continually innovating. That what must be going on. Must be changing the technology of production. And as we've noted that none of the Rockefellers are in the Forbes 400 any longer, right? That is, you have this in a market capitalist system, you have this movement of people from the lower lower socioeconomic status up to higher socioeconomic status, right? And so you have this movement within a market capitalist system that you don't have in other countries where the only way to move up is to get control of the government, right? If that's what's determining where I get wealthy as I become the minister of something, okay, then we want to maintain the government, right? And so you get authoritarian governments in those areas. So the bottom line that we're talking about here is that I wouldn't set prices below the cost of producing in order to drive out competitors because I don't have a mechanism to keep the new competitors from coming in once I raise my prices in order to overcome the losses that I sustained. All right. There's actually an interesting point that Howard Hotelling also made at about the same time that Mises makes in here, is that suppose you're worried about what we call exhaustible resources. If you have exhaustible resources, that is that, let's say it will eventually deplete. Let's say it's oil, right? You think you're going to run out of oil. Right? And of course, we're probably never going to run out of oil, but suppose that you're worried about that, right? Suppose that you're worried about this exhaustible resource. If you have a monopoly, what you'll learn in Econ 202 is a monopolist restricts the amount that they sell because for them, their marginal revenue, if you're a monopoly, sort of think about it, if you're a monopoly, then what will happen is, if I'm going to sell additional units, I got to lower the price on all the existing units. So what's going to happen is my added revenue from selling another unit is not what I'm going to get from that unit, but I'm going to get from that unit minus what I got to sell all the other units for. So again, when you look at the old exams and I have this marginal, I give you a total benefit curve or it's a table and a price table in some of them. And then I'll say, well, what if you pay, if you have to pay $5 for the first one and then $4 for the second one? We talked about why you see a sale that says, buy the first one and the second one's half off or something like that, is to try to capture that marginal benefit to you. And so what happens is a monopolist tends to produce where it would be a lower amount of output than would be the case of a firm that was perfectly competitive, where their marginal benefit is equal to, or their marginal revenue is actually equal to their price. And so Mises is making a point here, is that in exhaustible resources, a monopolist will actually use up the resources more slowly. And again, if you take Econ 402 or 415, we go through in much more detail what happens when you have exhaustible resources like this, et cetera. But anyway, the interesting thing about that is Mises is talking about this in 1927, and there's a paper by a guy named Hotelling that came out at about the same time that also made that point. So you might just at some point take a look at some of the writings of Howard Hotelling. All right, then he says that, so we talked about the monopoly. Then he talks a little about bureaucracy, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that next time, but in 1944, he writes a whole book on this. In 1944, he writes a book called Bureaucracy. What he does here in 1927 in liberalism, he's just sort of opening up the discussion on bureaucracy, and he's going to make a point about how can we tell, if we have government bureaucracy over here, so you have the Secretary of Education, and then you have an Assistant Secretary of Education, and then you have all these bureaucrats that go through the system in a government basis. How is it that that's any different than a large corporation where you have a similar thing, where you have a chief executive officer and you have a board of directors, and then you have a person that's in charge of the North American operations, you have a vice president here. So it looks very similar between a bureaucracy that is in a government agency and a bureaucracy that's in a private firm. And his point's going to be that in the private firm, that you have a profit signal that tells you when somebody's not doing a good job, whereas you don't have that in the government part. And we'll talk more about that next time. So what we're going to do is finish liberalism again. We're not doing liberal foreign policy. It's an interesting, chapter, but we're going to skip through that. And that will complete, so we'll almost certainly finish Mises's liberalism on Monday. And what we'll do is begin, we'll begin what's the next, what are we doing next? What's our next piece?
The law?
The law, yes. Okay, we'll be doing the law. Okay, so take a look at the law, and that's a short little book. But for the midterm, we'll stop at Mises's liberalism. Okay, so again, look at the old exams. If you have questions on that, and again, because the situation is such that we don't have as much interaction If you have questions on that, we'll have the review session on the Saturday, but we'll be enough ahead in terms of the lecture that we can probably devote at least half the class on Monday to answering questions that you might have. So if there's been something that, you've been looking at the old exams, there's a question about elasticity or, the demand and supply curves or whatever, why don't you come with some questions on Monday to talk about that, all right? Okay.